Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Holthouse, and I am the Climate Advisor to the Nature Conservancy Alaska chapter. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Dena'ina people here in Anchorage. The Nature Conservancy is the largest environmental organization in the world. We operate in all 50 states and over 70 countries and regions globally. Our mission is to create a future in which nature and people thrive. Climate change is a priority for the organization, and we are deploying resources across the globe to reverse the trajectory of climate change. As part of our climate work in Alaska, TNC is supporting leaders who are working to advance climate policy. With our Climate Opportunity Assessment Program, we're identifying the opportunities that federal and state climate policies can generate. We've contracted McKinley Research to produce 4 briefing papers outlining opportunities in areas of climate adaptive housing, natural climate solutions, alternative energy, and adaptive infrastructure. And over the course of this summer, these briefings will be shared broadly and used as the basis for a variety of events like this one. Young Americans of both political parties are increasingly looking for action to mitigate the worst effects of a changing climate. We're joined today by young Alaskans who are leading the way on climate change in a variety of ways. Young Republicans and Democrats both support action on climate more than their respective older generations, and young Alaskans in particular have set aside partisan differences to work together and call on elected officials to pass comprehensive and bipartisan legislation that addresses climate change. We know that the impact of climate change is felt most acutely by indigenous peoples and first generations. And we know that we need to follow the guidance of indigenous knowledge and youth to address the risks that we face. Convenings like this are key to ensuring that the next generation is included in making the decisions that matter the most. As you lead us into a secure future for Alaska, you are advocating for solutions that put Alaska and our unique issues first. Today's conversation is important to highlight the extent to which you are calling on our officials to pass legislation that addresses the root causes of climate change and mitigates its worst effects. I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank our panelists especially. And also would like to introduce and thank Rachel Callander and Jackson Blackwell of Callander and Associates and Andrew Tuck of the Nature Conservancy, who helped design this event. I will introduce all of our panelists next, and then we will hear from each of them and have time for questions at the end. So let me just launch into telling you who these wonderful people are. Carly Dennis is from Chugiak and a student at Pitzer College. Carly currently works at the Sitka Conservation Society as the Future of Alaska policy advocate. Brian Conwell is from Unalaska and is a student at Harvard. Brian is a Youth Civic Engagement Fellow at the Alaska Center and former Arctic Youth Ambassador. Nathan Bering is from Fairbanks and is a student at Gustavus Adolphus. He is a plaintiff in the Juliana versus United States case and is working with Launch Alaska. Eben Hobson is the Ukpiagvik-Inupiaq Corporation Science lead logistics media creator, an Arctic Youth Ambassador alumni, and a member of the Arctic Youth Network. Eben is also a traditional foods provider and a whaler from Ukpiagvik. Michaela Stith is a lifelong Alaskan, author, and works at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. She previously worked in Tromsø, Norway, with the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat. And lastly, Taylor Holshauser is from Eagle River and a graduate of Yale University. Taylor currently serves as the Director of Business Development for the Alaska Ocean Cluster and is a fellow at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. We're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives and very excited to welcome you. Carly, we're going to start with you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me. My parents moved to Alaska in 1986 for my dad's job with BP. And he worked for that oil company for 30 years. His BP salary supported our family and paid my college tuition. I wouldn't be an Alaskan, wouldn't have grown up on Dena'ina lands, and wouldn't have grown an appreciation for our Alaskan ways of life if not for the oil industry. Sometimes I wish this wasn't the case because I feel that it implicates me in a long chain of events that began before I was born, but continue to result in natural disasters and cultural devastation and a great deal of violence. The oil industry made Alaska rich and it made it possible for people like me to live here. But for so many different reasons, environmental and economic, the oil industry can't be our future. I began to understand that tension when I was in high school and I joined Alaska Youth for Environmental Action. The young people that I met in that program showed me that Alaska is my home and that I should care about it. And at the same time, I began to understand the challenges that our home faces. I've spent several years since then canvassing with Alaska Youth for Environmental Action in the Alaska Center, working on campaigns and going to conferences, and I now work at the Nature Conservation Society, and I'm almost finished with a degree in politics. And from all of those experiences, I've learned that working for change doesn't always mean signing petitions or marching or writing letters, though those things are certainly important and definitely have their place. What I found is even more powerful sometimes is building community with people who share our values. Things like sharing stories and eating wild harvested foods and listening and making things with our hands, and so many other things that connect us to each other and to this land that we share. It's experiences like those that convinced me that though my ancestors didn't live in these lands, my descendants might. Ultimately, I do think that it's local actions like these that will also prove the most powerful as we work to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Things like little things, growing a garden. It literally forces me to invest my future in the land I stand on, and it helps me lower my carbon footprint. Eating local things and buying local things and making what we can ourselves and sharing what we have with our neighbors. I don't think these are individual actions. I think they're community choices. They build our resilience and they help us prepare for change, and they make us independent and self-reliant. And to be clear, I think that there are many statewide and national policies that we must pursue alongside these things. Policies to regulate and limit oil companies and to price carbon and to catalyze renewable energy and to invest in the most vulnerable communities and the people who are most affected by climate change. But focusing on these big policy shifts is so much easier when we understand how they're connected to grassroots community care. I also think that the smaller and more local our actions are, the more they are detached from the partisan language that prompts us to divide everything into two categories. Intentional choices and decisions like these are political and they have political consequences, but they're not ideological. Living close to the land and within our means honors the people who have lived in this place in the past and the ones that will do so in the future, and it prepares us for the challenges of a changing climate. I believe that these decisions will require rejecting the kind of progress and sometimes prosperity that brought my parents to Alaska in favor of the values that have convinced me to stay. And as we move through this time of great transition and change, we have to be able to see what's coming and to imagine the future without forgetting the past. And I think that that's something that young people are especially positioned to do. Because even when we as young people don't agree on everything, we'll always share the same perspective because we are the ones connected to the parts of the future that are the furthest away from today. So I'm super grateful to you all for being here, for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of you. And I will pass it on to, I think Brian is the next person.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Conwell. I'm zooming in from Nungam land, and I'm currently located in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and that's where I'm from. And yeah, I'm currently a student at Harvard University and a summer fellow at the Alaska Center. And so on Alaska, if you don't know, and more specifically, the port of Dutch Harbor is the nation's #1 fishing port in terms of volume. And so the stakes of the climate crisis are really high here, because if climate change continues as it has, ocean acidification will continue and threaten the seafood industry, which is especially alarming regarding species like king crab, whose shells, when they're larvae, it has been found that they kind of just melt away with ocean acidification. And so, yeah, I'm worried about the future of Alaska because of these things, and also just because our economic history has been so characterized by boom bust cycles that often involve massive damage to the environment. And so for this panel, I was kind of hoping to take an example from where I grew up and related to possibly like the first iteration of this boom bust cycle. And so this is a story that sort of involves kayaks. So ikyaks in Nungam, which is the indigenous language of the Aleutians. And so before Russian colonization, Nungan peoples used primarily one-hatched ikyaks that were so masterfully built that, for example, one Russian missionary said that not even a mathematician could do much to improve it. And also others wrote that they could move through the ocean faster than birds could fly. And so, as many of you know, with Russian colonization came the exploitation of various different fur species, such as the sea otter and the fur seal. And the sea otter was traditionally hunted using the ikyak. But because the Russians wanted to continue harvesting more and more fur, they virtually enslaved the Nungan people of these islands and pushed hunting technology further and further, eventually introducing guns to the hunt. And with guns came a shift in the ikyaks from one-hatched kayaks to two-hatched kayaks, where the front paddler would be the rifleman and the back paddler would sort of stabilize the kayak. And then eventually three-hatched kayaks, where they would have two hunters and then one Russian who would sort of surveil and make sure all the hunters were catching the amount of like sea otters that they wanted. And so as this sort of progressed, sea otter populations virtually went to zero in the Aleutian Islands, which is really surprising if you live here now, just because of wherever you go, you know, if you're driving next to the ocean, you can see tons of sea otters. But that was a sort of boom bust cycle that characterized the Aleutians, and it is seen in the shift from kayaks moving to one-hatched kayaks, which are just perfectly built, to two-hatched kayaks and three-hatched kayaks, which sort of show the level of exploitation that the Russian colonization came to be committed to in the Aleutians. And so I think from this example, one thing that you can take away from this is that indigenous knowledge and the creation of things like these really perfect like kayaks tends to get lost in these like boom bust cycles that characterize Alaska's history. And so I think moving forward, one way that Alaskans can hopefully sort of mitigate these boom bust cycles or eliminate them entirely, and also follow the lead of indigenous peoples, is to listen to indigenous knowledge and follow the lead of indigenous leaders, who I think that, you know, we can learn a ton from. And so myself as a non-indigenous person, these examples from history are really instrumental in deciding like what I want to do in terms of like these political decisions that, as Carly was saying, like really seem to be based on these ideological lines and stuff. But I think that if we go back to listening to, you know, indigenous elders in our community, looking at our history, we can really find solutions to these problems, or at least find you know, a good way to move forward. So yeah, that's all I had. And I think I'm passing it to Nathan.
Hey, can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Nathan Bering. I'm calling in from Lower Tanana land, also known as Fairbanks, Alaska. And I currently attend college in St. Peter, Minnesota on the lands of the Dakota. And I'm bringing kind of I'm going to start by taking a step back and saying that I'm going to bring two very westernized perspectives to this conversation. And I think that one of the strengths of the climate movement is that we only recognize what we can speak for, and that we don't attempt to speak over peoples who have lived in this land, for example, for many, many generations longer than colonization happened, and that we are making sure that at every stage of any movement that we call climate justice, we need to be soliciting actively the knowledge of the peoples who live in this land. And so I'm making sure that I only can speak to I'm going to speak to the constitutional side of what I see as the path forward in Alaska. And then I also want to speak to the fact that, the oil economy that we have in the state right now is a dead end. And we want to make sure that we not only recognize that there are ways for Alaska to be on the cutting edge of the climate technology economy and the ways that we move forward out of this predicament, but we also make sure that we're including labor justice in that, and that we aren't allowing, the workforce that a speaker earlier mentioned essentially built this state and provided Alaska the path through the future, that we make sure that we're including them in this transition. So I really want to emphasize, climate advocates in Alaska are no stranger to the reality that Alaska is an oil-dependent economy, even today, and that more than a third of our private industry is dependent on the oil industry. But as I mentioned, this economy is no longer viable. I mean, even yesterday, we saw that Keystone XL, under crippling public pressure and also just economic non-feasibility, has been canceled. We saw a Dutch court ruled that Shell must cut its emissions by 50%. We see Chevron and Exxon both just had significant changes to the makeup of their board of directors, all in the interest of lowering their carbon emissions. And now more than ever, we're seeing massive investments from companies like BP in alternative energies, and making commitments that are major on the international stage towards moving away from further developing fossil fuels. And so the PR has shifted, and the world is pushing ever quicker for a modern energy system that is characterized by clean energy. And so my work at Launch Alaska, which is Alaska's first sustainable accelerator, is showing me that Alaska has huge potential as a ground for major investments in climate technology. Alaska is a world leader in renewable microgrids that are deconnected from our energy grid. Alaska is a huge leader in wild fisheries and the technologies that come with AI and incorporating kind of how we navigate the harshest ocean conditions in the world, and how we kind of keep our fisheries sustainable, and how we pollute our oceans. And we have a major investment capabilities in these areas, and we need more R&D and research into these areas as we go forward. But what we really need now, in light of all of this inevitable change, is we need the policy support, and we need the accountability from our politicians to our oil labor force that ensures that we're all included in this transition, that Alaska continues to be a place that people come to raise their families. But at the same time, I really want to emphasize that at every stage of this process that we are actively soliciting input and leadership from the frontline indigenous communities that are already being ravaged today by the impacts of climate change, such as Shishmaref, Kivalina, and multiple coastal villages that are losing their shoreline as of right now, and the increasing barge traffic that is happening because there's no longer Arctic sea ice forming as late, and it's allowing more unregulated barge traffic or tourism traffic. And we need to make sure that we are accountable to the traditional caretakers of these lands. I also wanted to shift real quick and just to briefly talk that our nation also needs a constitutional framework. So as a plaintiff on the Juliana v. United States national lawsuit, which calls for our government to take accountability for its role in creating the climate crisis, we need to recognize that it is time for a constitutional mandate that recognizes harm to young people's fundamental rights and provides the judicial backstop for legislative policy, because young people are often a voteless population, but they are one of the most significant stakeholders in energy policy decisions that are being made today that are gambling the stability of their future climate away in front of their eyes. And so those are the two key areas that I'm paying attention to, but I want to be mindful of the only elements that I can speak to and the immense amount of information that I need to learn. So I'm so grateful that I can learn a lot from all of you today, and I'm very happy to be in this mission with you all. Thank you so much. And I think I'm passing it to Michaela, or
I think it's Eben first. No.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eben Hobson. I'm calling in from Iqaluit, Alaska. I am Inupiaq, and I am calling in from the northernmost community in Alaska. And one thing that I wanted to talk about today was what I do for work and how it helps hunters and fishermen here in the coastal communities of the North Slope understand on a scientific level what is changing and how it is changing, and what we can use as traditional knowledge to better help. Or shoot, wait. I I really don't I really don't have anything written down really, but one of my positions at the UIC Science Building is I photograph and I film some groups of scientists, and I turn all those photos and videos into this film, and I put those films out to the online, and what people do. Oh, shoot, man, dang it! All right, well, would somebody else be able to go first, and then I'll come back in, I guess, 10 minutes or so, and I'll have it better written down. I was really busy at work today, and I didn't really have any time to write anything down. So I sorry, thank you, sorry.
No problem. My name is Michaela Stith. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, and I'm actually really excited to be going in between Eben and Taylor, because Taylor is someone I work with regularly at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. And I also just published a book entitled Whelp, Climate Change and Arctic Identities. And I interviewed Eben for that book, and he provided a lot of valuable insights. So a little bit more about me is that I'm the second generation of my family to grow up in Alaska. My dad moved to Alaska when he was 2 with my grandpa, who was part of the Federal Aviation Administration, and they were the only Black family in their settlement. Since my dad was born and moved to Alaska, Anchorage's annual temperature has increased 7 degrees Fahrenheit. I've seen a lot of changes in my own life, from cool, wet summers to more hot and smoky ones, from digging tunnels through the snow when I was little to having 40-degree melt periods in December and January. And also I've seen a lot of more industrial development, the elimination of wetlands in my childhood neighborhoods, for example, or on C Street in Minnesota, where wetlands were eliminated for a parking lot that hasn't really been developed. I have many cherished memories from being outside with my family as a child, but my dad actually passed away, and I'd like to be able to recall those memories with familiar landscapes. So these personal connections to climate and landscape drove me to study environmental science and policy when I went to Duke University. And with my science background there, I understand that the warming climate will acidify oceans, like Brian has talked about, which may lead to fish stock collapses, that the melting ice from the Arctic will reduce the overall albedo of the Earth, causing changes to global air currents and ultimately contributing to sea level rise across the planet. Nowhere, though, have we seen changes so quick and so drastic as in the Arctic and in Alaska, where warming is at least 3 times greater than the global average. And we know that these changes are man-made and linked to fossil fuel use. Having studied policy, also working for a policy think tank, and being a young person faced with the fact that we will see most of a collapse of our fish stocks and ice-free summers in the Arctic by 2050, I'm also focused on solutions. But it's very clear that there won't be a simple or a technical solution, like Carly kind of alluded to. Really, we need a cultural shift. We can't just switch to renewable energy. We're in the midst of an Anthropocene, the Anthropocene, which is a geological epoch where humans are the greatest influence on the environment. But that's not just climate, that's also biodiversity and vegetation cover. And the earliest geologically supported period for the Anthropocene was 1610, which is when Europeans began to displace people and resources across seas using stolen labor and land. And since the 1960s, we've been living in an extremely globalized economy. Today, we are living under the most unequal conditions recorded in history, with primarily white people making billions in some cases, while a billion people, mostly Black and brown, live in poverty. So I'm looking forward to talking about today how climate change is inextricably linked to racial and ethnic inequality, and really is based on the unequal ownership and valuation of land and resources. So when we think about climate change solutions in Alaska and more broadly, we really have to put human rights at the center of our actions there. And particularly in Alaska, as most people here have alluded to, it's critical that we focus on the free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples here in Alaska for new development, whether it be renewable or extractive, and also recognize that our policy development must be representative of the peoples who live in Alaska. Thank you. I'm so excited to discuss more.
Does Eben want to go? Eben, I don't know if you're on the line. I'm happy to go otherwise.
I will go after you. I'm almost done finishing what I have written down.
No worries at all. Happy to go. Well, first off, I'd like to thank Stephanie for the very kind introductions, and to Andy, Rachel, and Jackson for putting this together. I'm coming near the end here of a pretty distinguished group of folks, and I'm frankly fairly intimidated by and impressed by just the caliber of the folks here on this panel and what everyone is working on in your remarks. I really would like to thank Nathan for calling out very early on that we come here to speak about what we know, not about what we don't know. I can bring, I think, to this conversation a focus on two things, which are innovation and infrastructure. And so perhaps a little bit about me to kind of justify why I can speak about those things. Taylor Holshouser, I was born and raised in Eagle River, went to Yale for undergrad and came back. I now work for the Alaska Ocean Cluster, and I'm a research fellow working alongside Michaela at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. And between the Ocean Cluster and the Wilson Center, I cover innovation and infrastructure kind of writ large. The Ocean Cluster right now is working with 6 companies that are working on a range of very cool issues, primarily ocean focused, from maritime domain awareness improvements to reducing ghost gear and plastic waste going into the ocean. And through working with those 6 companies, one of the things I've come to realize is that innovation and adaptation when it comes to climate change are often synonymous, not always. But in the case of what we're working on, I often think that a lot of the companies, a lot of the startups, a lot of the founders, entrepreneurs, and activists as well, have solutions. We need to build the infrastructure that enables them to continue tinkering, to continue exploring options, and enabling other people to follow in the trails that they blaze. And so when we think about innovation, it can occur in a vacuum. It doesn't require a complex, adaptive entrepreneurial ecosystem to work. Innovation, as they like to say, the old joke is innovation is necessity is the mother of innovation. And so, you can innovate in a vacuum. You can do it alone. You can do it through perseverance, but we can also accelerate it. And that's where I see policymakers, that's where I see this community having the greatest impact, is building that system. And from the policymakers to anyone who might be on this call or who may watch this recording, please invest in the basic infrastructure we need to move atoms, to move electrons, to move bits. Those are the things that really are the foundation of society. And for innovation to occur, you need all 3 of those in motion of some kind. So that's, ports and roads, it's digital broadband infrastructure, it's, the energy systems, the renewable power stations, all of that is needed. We also need, I think, a community that's working to support the entrepreneurs who are taking risks, the people who are out there working without a salary, who are working with huge amounts of money at play, often with no guarantees that they'll ever be able to pay it back. Those folks need all the support we can give them. And they're not going to be a huge percentage of society. They're very small often, but they do need support. And that support can come in many ways. It can come from policymakers. It can come from people on this call, being a friend, being an ally, just being there when they're needed. And I think when we think about beyond just the basic infrastructure and beyond just the community, we really need to make investments in those things: education, schools, hospitals, the quality of life. And I guess if I wrap up my kind of esoteric and kind of random remarks here, it would be to say that I really hope that as we move forward in the future, we have an infrastructure growth system, a development system that's focused on building internal capacity for societies, not on extracting resources and leaving behind what's left for other people to deal with. That, I think, as Brian alluded to and made very, I think, eloquent in the remark about kind of cyclical or kind of boom bust economies, all too often we build things to take things out, not to build capacity internally. And so that's, I think, where I'll wrap up there and turn it over to Eben. I don't know if I made full 5 minutes, maybe I went over, but Eben, over to you.
Look, I I apologize about that when I first spoke, but I have something written down that briefly explains what I do for my job. So the climate change up here in northern Alaska and the science community of the North Slope. I was in Virginia in 2019 attending and speaking on a panel. And I mentioned how climate change affects us as traditional people living off the land or living off the ocean. And I mentioned our main source of food, the bowhead whale, and how we, or what we do to go out and hunt the whales in the springtime and fall time. And one other thing that I mentioned is that seeing all of these university science groups heading up, and what they're not really telling us what they're doing out there. So one of my jobs is to film and record a couple interviews and head out with those scientists to get some B-roll footage and to make a short video of what they're doing and how to, I guess, put it in layman's terms for the local communities that these science groups are in. And so one of the things that one of the groups I recently recorded, they were monitoring the CO2 levels in the lagoon here, in the Elson Lagoon here, here in Putkirvik. And as a hunter and fisherman that lives off of the that lives off of the lagoon, getting seals and fish, and noticing that they're monitoring those CO2 levels, it kind of worries me to see or to think that those CO2 levels might be affecting the whales, the walruses, seals, fish, polar bears, and they were also monitoring or how the CO2 affects the little microorganisms, the bottom of the food chain. And I was wondering how it affects the animals further up the food chain. And I guess with the video that I'll be putting out there, it'll, I guess, tell the whole community what's going on. But I guess that's really it. I honestly really wasn't prepared for this meeting. But if you guys have any other questions about what I do and what it's like living up here, living through all of the changes as a hunter and fisherman, I guess you can reach out to Rachel, and I'm pretty sure she'll give you my email. We can chat over email, but I really wasn't prepared for this meeting. So I guess I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
I think that's everyone. And thank you all so very much for your perspectives and your words and your wisdom. Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you for the Q&A session now. So I'll just give you the mic.
Sounds great. And thank you, Eben, for joining and for your comments. I don't think you sounded unprepared at all. So I valued hearing from you. And I know you're having some connection issues. So thanks for navigating that and for being here. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Colander. I am joining this Zoom from Denina Land, where I live and work, but I was born and raised in a commercial fishing family in Cordova, Alaska, on the land of the Eyak people. I have really enjoyed listening to all of your unique perspectives, not only as young leaders, but as Alaskans equipping yourselves with the knowledge, tools, advocacy experience, and education from many corners of our state. As we all know, Alaska is facing great change in the climate space, great opportunities, but also great challenges. And I think what we also know is true is that your leadership is valued and very needed. So thank you for being a part of this discussion today. And I hope through the Nature Conservancy, we can continue to have more discussions that include your voices as well in the near future. So I'd like to invite any attendees on the line to type your questions into the Q&A chat on your screen so that we can spend the remainder of time, about 20 minutes, moving through those questions. I'm going to check that right now. I don't see any yet, but I have a few prepared to tee us up here. So to get us started, and anyone can speak first. So this isn't to one specific question, as one specific person. As young leaders, how can policy, political, and business leaders better incorporate your voices into decision making? Specific to the national climate conversation or here in Alaska?
I can take this from one angle, the angle that I can best speak to, and that's the constitutional angle. So I think what really needs to be a kind of paradigm shift that we have in our national conversation on climate is kind of two key changes that relate to the Constitution. The first is the recognition of young people who may not yet be 18 and have an active vote in the legislative process, that their voices are still equally valid in the energy decision space because of the direct impact that current energy decisions will be having on the stability of their future climate. And I think that's something that only the Constitution can really provide. So we have a public trust doctrine that mandates that the government holds essential natural resources in common interest for their protection for the full public. We also have the Fifth Amendment, which protects the rights to life, liberty, and property, and various other kind of substantive due process rights that young people have, regardless of whether they can vote, that the court system really needs to elevate when it comes to energy decisions. And then I would also just say that the other side of that is the recognition of the full cost of our energy decisions. So when we're talking about like, oh, how much does it cost to, put in a new pipeline? We not only need to be thinking about what's the, capital cost and what's the, job cost and what's the positive economic cost, but we also have to think about what's the cost to the climate system, what's the cost to the water supply, what's the cost to, the communities that are actually living there, when we see so many projects around the nation that are being actively resisted on the ground by frontline communities. And why is there no analysis of the impact there and just on the project itself? And so I think that's the other side, that the Constitution is an important document, including that side of the conversation.
Thank you, Nathan. Anyone else have comments on that question?
I have just one thing to add. I totally agree with Nathan. I would also say I think we've seen like a lot of really wonderful opportunities that have started to come up more and more for young people of leaders, elected officials, kind of making opportunities for young people to come through. Like I'm thinking of Governor Walker's Climate Action Leadership Team convention with young leaders. I'm thinking of more and more internships and fellowships and conferences where young people are given the space and the opportunity to speak their mind. And I think these are super important in being able to engage young people to elevate them and bring them up. But I also think that that needs to be paired with leaders and elected officials kind of like coming down, I suppose, too, because there's a lot of young people that don't have the ability to engage in these kind of opportunities that for whatever reason aren't going to be the ones who are stepping out and going to internships and conferences. And so I think in those scenarios, creating the opportunities for young people that are easy, that go to young people, kind of creating spaces that are community-based and value added, so that you're also helping young people and giving them the opportunities and then simultaneously listening to what their needs are, I think is really important.
Do you feel, Carly, like that would be going into schools? I'm just curious. I know that there's probably people who will watch this recording thinking to themselves, like, in earnest, you know, they want to do what you're saying, but probably have question marks.
Yeah, I think like examining the opportunities that exist. So like school programs, civic engagement programs, like youth clubs, things like that already exist, that have lots of answers and values in them. And just being able to kind of like go in and listen more intentionally, I guess.
Awesome.
Rachel, I have a quick point
Feeling.
about, I think we also need to folks who are in positions of leadership, really, especially in the business community, from what I'm seeing and have seen, really need to be focused on how do we allow the next generation and the youngest generation to start building wealth today in an equal, kind of equitable way. So it's not just extreme forms of, you know, you've founded a successful unicorn-backed kind of startup that makes you a billionaire, but really a way to build long-term wealth in the communities where you're from. So whether that's being able to access capital from a bank or a revenue-based financing institution or a venture capitalist, we need those folks who control that allocation of capital to be recognizing the kind of responsibility they have to the younger generation, because that's, I think we've seen across the US, but especially in Alaska, that the allocation of capital is often happening in a private way. It's very much hidden from a lot of views, I think, and I think it's very disproportionately gone to those who already have a significant amount of privilege. I mean, it tends to go, frankly, to people who are like me, who are white males with, you know, Ivy League degrees. That I think needs to change. And I really hope that those listening to the call will take that to heart.
Great, thanks, Taylor. We do have a question in the Q&A bar from Tristan Glowa. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. It was directed to myself and Stephanie, so I don't want to take too much time away from the panelists, but do want to answer this in case there are others asking the same question. Tristan asked about the climate opportunity assessment that TNC Alaska has commissioned. Is this report already written, or are you seeking out the voices of young Alaskans influencing the drafting of it? How else are you hoping to connect the perspectives and needs of young Alaskans who have been articulating strong visions for climate justice in Alaska? I will pivot to Stephanie in 2 seconds on that, but to share my own point, someone working with TNC Alaska on this, the reports in a basic sense have been commissioned through McKinley Research Group and will be debuted publicly through events much like these and other forums throughout the summer into the fall. The reason that those are moving through McKinley is to really get like the first of its kind third party or report series and the research done by you know, real researchers who do this full time, to make sure that it's not coming from a TNC or other perspective with any agenda, but to really create a new body of data sets and information for the public to consider. However, Tristan, I will add that we have been talking prior to this event, and my colleague and I have been talking during this event a little bit about how valuable this conversation has been, and the voices of these leaders and others, and how we'll be making sure through TNC that this recording and other information gets to McKinley, should they take these voices and considerations into their work as they push out these reports. But if Stephanie has points to make about the report commissioning as the TNC official on the call, that would also be great.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. Those reports are not yet done. And we we intend to use this kind of event and what we're hearing, all of the perspectives that we're hearing today, to inform those reports going forward. And I guess the only other thing to say about that is that we will focus McKinley to include youth in their outreach as they do their data collection. And so, yes, it's very important to us.
Thank you, Stephanie. Kelsey Schober has said thank you to everyone for your introductions and responses so far. My question is related to climate policy. How do you think we make climate solutions appealing across the aisle, especially at the state level, despite Alaska's history of dependence on oil? Open it up to the group.
I think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go for it, Brian.
I think just my initial thoughts on this is, politicians are beholden to their constituents, and as we were saying, I think early in this panel, young people tend not to vote at the same rate that older people do, but also young people are more committed to, or are at least from what I've read and heard, more committed to figuring out solutions to climate change, and are less likely to be like climate deniers or maybe climate defeatists also. And so my sort of perspective on this question is sort of, especially right now with all these bills popping up in different states related to making voting more difficult, making voting more easy for young people so that young people can sort of get their voice heard related to getting politicians elected who care about climate change. And I don't think that has to be a sort of Republican or Democrat issue. I think there are people on the right and on the left that can sort of like be elected and at least believe in climate change, and hopefully also believe in some sort of climate solution. So that's what I was thinking.
Any others? I have a follow-up that's related. Yep, Carly?
Yeah, thank you. Kelsey, thanks. I think that's a really important question, and definitely agree with what Brian said. I think a big part of this has to be the transition away from oil and the focus on climate change. I think we have to be really intentional about not just rejecting something, but also highlighting solutions and making it very clear that the solutions are there, they exist, they're there, and we don't need to be just moving away, but rather moving towards something. And I think part of that has to do with innovation, like Taylor was talking about. Part of that has to do with the economic conditions that Nathan was talking about, but being intentional about making that narrative moving towards something. And I do think that sometimes we have to be careful, because I think it's very easy to kind of say like, oh, the tourism industry or the fishing industry will take over and it'll be very easy and they have the capacity to take over for oil. When in reality, it really can't be any one thing that we replace. It's going to have to be a lot of very small things. And so we have to be intentional about that, I think, and careful also of scale, because I think scale is something that can be dangerous if any one industry gets too big. And I think that's why we've had a lot of issues with oil companies. But definitely, I think like the way that we frame solutions will be really big.
Getting a little bit more niche to the actual political dynamic and climate solutions question that was just asked. We have another question here. Republicans and Democrats are more divided than ever. However, young Republicans diverge with their older peers when it comes to the issue of climate change. how can you all as young Alaskans and future leaders of the state work collaboratively to address and advocate for an issue impacting all Alaskans?
I mean, yeah, kind of tying it to how I kind of framed my my commentary from earlier, and also I really liked the point that Carly made. I think it's really all about conveying a future vision and then never burning bridges on how we get there, like constantly having all the stakeholders, whether that's, you know, the frontline communities that are already experiencing the effects, or, you know, the, as I mentioned, the labor force that essentially built this state, you know, back in the 70s when oil was booming, and, you know, we were still in the throes of this type of energy system. I think it's really, really key, especially because Alaska is Alaska is just too small. I don't think I've ever been in Seattle and gotten on a flight to Fairbanks and not known at least 5 people on the plane. Like, and I'm really not exaggerating. There's something really pure about Alaskan politics that, despite, I think we're really facing some severe ideological, demagogic challenges right now. But I think Alaska is uniquely poised to show how we don't burn bridges in those ways, because it's just not possible with a state this small and also geographically large, and economic challenges to the max, about how we keep energy costs low while simultaneously, you know, paving the way to the future, for things like I mentioned, renewable microgrids, that are kind of world leaders in deployment prospects in rural Alaska in places like Kotzebue and Kodiak. And I think that I think we have to be really, really intentional about presenting the vision, kind of to Carly's point, in a really positive way. Like, this is a good shift. Not only is it a necessary shift, but look what we can build together. And I think there are a lot of frontline groups like Alaska's Just Transition Collective, that are really speaking to kind of what we stand to gain when we embrace the energy transition. But we may have to make sure we're constantly building the connections to, you know, the current, you know, industry leaders who are still kind of tied to the third of private employment that is still deeply connected to the oil industry. But I don't think it's an undoable prospect at all.
Thanks, Nathan. That's a very interesting perspective that prompts me to think about not only our time, but maybe one last question to some of the comments that you just made that can, you know, have everyone sort of give their answer. So in a nutshell, this is a big question, but I'm going to ask you to synthesize so that we can maybe move all the way around the screen before we get some closing comments from Stephanie. Is speaking on behalf of yourself, as an advocate, as someone passionate about climate, and as an Alaskan, but also maybe speaking on behalf of your classmates from Alaska or your friends, so other young leaders. What do you think that you need as young leaders to really see the change and be a part of the change and the solutions as you would like to see them? So what do you think you need, either from the state, leaders like the Nature Conservancy, policymakers, either from our Alaska delegation in DC or state legislators? Just an open question to get your thoughts on, and then we'll close out the meeting. Thanks so much.
I can go ahead. I think that what we need is access. The issue, I think, that is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about policy is that our policymakers, whether Democrats or Republicans, don't really represent the diversity of our state. And so when we're talking about how do we get their attention or how do we work with them, it's often very challenging when we don't speak the same language or terms don't mean the same things to us. You know, maybe if I mention colonization, that's an immediate turnoff to someone, and they won't want to engage with me on topics because they see that as looking towards the past rather than healing from the past and working toward the future. And so I think, like I said, what we really need is access and real representation.
Thanks, Michaela.
I can go next. Yeah, definitely. I think that in one sense, sadly, I don't think there's a ton of easy answers. And I think it's often super alluring to think that if we just put money in the right places, then that'll be okay. But I guess what I really think we need is more conversations and better listening. I think a lot of what we've had is like a crisis of language that, I mean, it's slightly partisan in that prevents us from reaching those conclusions, from reaching bipartisan, sensible conclusions, from reaching community solutions, but also being able to use language that kind of gets us past that to see how everything is connected. And our failure to see how things have been connected in the past has been a huge part of that. So I guess need more conversations and need more listening and better listening. And that goes for listening to young people as well as listening to people who may be qualitatively young, not quantitatively. So I guess, yeah, more conversations, better listening, better language.
I would just echo that and say, I think the better listening, but also patience. We're figuring this out. We're young, you know, we're going to say things that are going to anger people. We're going to say things that make people scared. And we may not mean to do that when we say it. So I think patience from leaders and trust that, you know, we're all trying to work towards the same ideal kind of solution. We want to make the world a better place. We may not understand the consequences of actions, but at the same time, we may have better understanding because of our unique experiences. And so I think I would just echo Carly's point and say, yeah, listen, have some patience, and give us some time. You know, I think you look around this panel, there's a lot of people working on really, really cool, important stuff here. It'll be really interesting if this panel were to convene in 10 years. I would hopefully be an observer on that, just to see where everyone is and what they've accomplished.
I agree with what everyone said, and I guess what I would add to that is we really need our politicians to be more visionary than they are right now. And I would say on both sides of the aisle, but I would also just say any politician who is, in my opinion, really selling their labor force short if they're in a region that is so dependent on the current energy system, but by pure market forces alone, that's not a sustainable trajectory. And we really need to unleash what we constantly call, you know, the power of, you know, ingenuity and the power of, you know, like the World War II era type of, you know, New Deal era prosperity and progress. And but this time, now that we know, we're starting, and I emphasize starting, we're starting to reckon more with our history around issues like colonization, around racial justice. We need to make sure that it's a collaborative effort, but that we have the vision in mind. I think we really, really need politicians to start to be more visionary with us.
One thing that I wanted to make a comment about was to have more indigenous representation in panels like this, just to give more, or just to give a broader range of how climate change affects who it affects on a daily basis. So that's one thing that I wanted to say, or as like a last remark. All right.
Yeah, and I agree with what everyone else has said. And just as a last thing, when I was in high school, and I think also maybe my first year of college, like being on a youth member of different boards and committees was really helpful. And so if you're someone who's on some sort of board or committee or school board, I think that, you know, trying to put in a youth member could be a really concrete way in order to like move these things forward and just, you know, set up a place for youth to be able to lend their voice.
That's a great point, Brian. I totally agree from my experience as well. Just being able to have a seat at the table is huge. Thank you all so much for your comments. This was very informative. And I also just wanted to point out that this was the first Zoom event of a series that we'll do that will sort of partner and help to inform and collaborate with the reports that TNC has commissioned. So we'll be sure to invite you to those future events and conversations as well to hopefully add even more synergy between the different expertise groups that we'll be convening. So thank you so much, and we hope you can continue to participate in this series. And I'll pivot to Stephanie for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you all. We're out of time. So I just want to say that, I believe that climate change issues and solutions are a philosophical question for us about how we are going to live. And I feel like I'm hearing that from you all, and that you have already decided for that future that we can, attain. And so I'm very inspired. And I'm that old generation, but I am not a boomer who is willing to say, we created this problem and now you all need to fix it. I really want to work on it, and I want to follow you. So thank you for leading, and thank you for being here with us today. Super informative and really inspiring. So have a wonderful day, and thank you so much.